Hello everyone, and welcome to the January Model Aquatic Health Code Network webinar titled Cyanuric Acid, It's Not Just About Crypto, with our featured speaker, Richard Falk, from the Council for the Model Aquatic Health Code. Before we get started, there are just a few logistics to go over. Audio is provided through your computer speakers. There is no need to dial into any conference line, as the phone line is for presenters only. Again, please do not dial into any conference line. Due to the number of attendees on the webinar, all participants will be muted. Please submit any questions and comments via the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. The Q&A portion of today's webinar will take place after our featured presenter, but please feel free to submit any questions or comments throughout the duration of the webinar. Finally, this webinar is being recorded and will be distributed to all participants. It can also be viewed on the CMAHC Network webpage. First of all, just a few updates from NACCHO. Our next webinar will be taking place in March, as this is a bi-monthly presentation. In addition, NACCHO is really interested in hearing your feedback about the webinar series, and we will be launching a survey to gather your opinions. So if you're interested in providing some feedback on how the webinars are working, please go ahead and sign up for the Model Aquatic Health Code Network, which is the next bullet. You can see below there are some details on how you can sign up. You'll have access to the archived webinars and MAC resources on the web page, and you'll get notifications about future webinars, as well as, of course, an invitation to participate in our survey. So that's it from NACCHO. Without further ado, I will hand things over to Doug Sackett, the Executive Director of the Council for the Model Aquatic Health Code. Go ahead, Doug.
Okay, thanks, Grace, and good morning or afternoon, everyone, depending on what side of the country you're on. I've got just a few brief updates from CMAHC. Just an update on the MAC process, where we're at. As you probably know, we had our conference in October. Voting on the 179 change requests closed on November 19th. The CMAHC, myself and the Board of Directors, we've reviewed and analyzed the results, and we've formally transmitted our recommendations to Centers for Disease Control on January 19th. The next step is CDC is to review the vote results and the CMAHC recommendations, and they will revise the MAC as appropriate, and expects to release the third edition the summer of 2018 swim season. Just again, a reminder, just refresher that there was a vote to change the conference cycle to a 3-year cycle instead of 2 years. So the next vote on the code conference will be in 2020. Point I'd like to, stress, my key message here is we need you, all memberships expired at the end of the conference cycle, so need to renew for those that were past members, and if you haven't become a member yet, encourage you to sign up. There's details on this as to how to go about signing up on the CMAHC website. And any questions, here's my contact information, which is also available on the CMAHC website, and some information or some links to the CDC MAC website and the CMAHC website for additional information. And now I'll turn it back over to Grace, who will be introducing our speaker.
Thanks, Doug. So we are very lucky today to be joined by our featured presenter, Richard Falk. Richard has been deeply engaged in the areas of pool and spa water chemistry for over 13 years. His deep analysis of the chlorine-cyanuric acid relationship has been helping the Council for the Model Aquatic Health Code develop scientifically sound principles for regulating free chlorine and cyanuric acid. He is a member of the Cyanuric Acid Ad Hoc Committee of the Council for the Model Aquatic Health Code. Richard, take it away. Richard, are you with us?
Can you not hear me?
Oh, hi, Richard.
Right,
there you are.
now we can.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, you're good. Thanks. Sorry about that.
Okay, you had me muted, I think. So, yes, I'm Richard Falk on the committee, ad hoc committee that was formed to investigate cyanuric acid chlorine relationship and its impacts on health from a scientific perspective. We have on the committee a wide variety of different participants from industry, different sides of the industry, Ellen Meyer, Stan Pickens, Roy Vore that are listed. We have Professor of Chemistry Chip Blatchley, many of you may be familiar with, Laura Supes, also a professor, and I neglected to mention Tom Keekler. Tom Keekler also in the industry. Roy Vore is more in the biologics side. Okay, so without further ado, let's go into the presentation. So the charge of the committee was to provide a balanced objective examination of the effects of CYA on the risk of disease transmission from routine use, not AFRs. So everything except for some bonus material at the end that you'll see in this presentation is not applicable to the accidental fecal releases of diarrhea or formed stools. It is from the regular slow fecal sloughing that occurs from bathers while they're in the pool instead. That's what this is focused on. The purpose is to provide guidance to define future limits based on the cyanuric acid and chlorine chemistry, based on a review of the literature on the effects of cyanuric acid on microbial and activation kinetics, calculating the risk to bathers, and summarizing our assumptions, results, and conclusions. Okay, so very briefly, we'll cover the chemistry, but very briefly, look at the kill rates based on hypochlorous acid. HOCl stands for hypochlorous acid, which is the active form of chlorine, as you'll see demonstrated. We'll talk about the cyanuric acid-free chlorine ratio, why that is important. We'll look at a steady-state pathogen model, which will be used to be able to calculate risk in swimming pools, give some example results, and discuss them, although mostly what we'll do is go to Q&A at that point. Okay, so let's first look at the cyanuric acid and chlorine chemistry. This chart should be very familiar to most of you. This is the chart of the percent of hypochlorous acid as a function of pH in pools. Hypochlorous acid being the primary active sanitizer, which is higher at lower pH. Note that there's a 50% drop in the hypochlorous acid. Let me see if the pen works when I draw it. Oh, it does. Excellent. Okay. So you can see there's a 50% drop, actually 50% going from 7.5 to 8, and even further going from 7 to 8. Okay. Let's go to the next slide. There are, in looking at the chlorine-cyanuric acid relationship, it's complicated. It's straightforward, but very tedious because there's so many different equations involved. That's what you see on the left side, are the various chemical species of chlorine, of cyanuric acid, chlorine, trichlor, and so on the left side. And there's some additional equations with hypochlorous acid as well. There's 13 reactions in total, 10 of which are independent. So it's a bit of a mess, which is why a lot of people haven't looked at it, but it was definitively determined as far as all the relationships, equilibrium constants, in 1974, so this is not new. So how does this equilibrium model, using this, how does CYA affect that HOCl versus pH curve that we looked at? Let's take a look. So you can see now the same red line we had before, but in addition to that, we now have additional lines, and notice that in the 30 ppm cyanuric acid, which is not particularly high, you can see that it goes very flat, which means that pH has a much smaller effect when cyanuric acid is present. Obviously, the absolute magnitude of the hypochlorous acid has dropped, but the effect of pH on that smaller magnitude is less. And so that's an important effect. Okay. Next is how does this affect disinfection? Let's first take a look at bacteria. So these are CT graphs which show on the left-hand side the log reductions. They're natural logarithm, but the blue lines you'll see the horizontal lines are in the standard log 10 that you may be more familiar with. So there's counting from the top 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. But this is one bacteria, Streptococcus, that was looked at by 3 different researchers from 1965 and 67 and 1994. And what you'll see on the right-hand side is, a bit of a mess, right, in terms of there's not a lot of good correlation there. And in fact, free chlorine, this is the CT based on looking at the free chlorine number. This really is not the right way of looking at it, which is why I'm putting an X over there. Instead, you'll see that there's a much better lineup, not perfect, but a much better lineup here on the left, where this is based on hypochlorous acid. Okay. So we just looked at bacteria and see that hypochlorous acid tracks to the what's known as the Chick-Watson model of disinfection. Let's see how another pathogen works with that. Specifically, let's take a look at Cryptosporidium parvum. And again, we see the same sort of a thing on the free chlorine, or it's called available chlorine here, but it's the free chlorine level. You can see that while there's some that seem to be straight, and if you look at those are the ones like the control without cyanuric acid or the ones with very low cyanuric acid relative to free chlorine. There are others that are just all over the map, and then these numbers also notice the magnitude is much higher than on the left graph, and those are the ones that are having a lot of cyanuric acid. So again, don't look at free chlorine. That's not the relevant number to look at by itself in order to determine the inactivation kinetics, kill times, kill power. Instead, see that not quite straight, a little bit curved, but you can see that if you look at the hypochlorous acid concentration as calculated by those complicated or numerous equations that I showed before, that you can predict kill times quite well. So, so we should look at hypochlorous acid, not the separate free chlorine or cyanuric acid in isolation. So how can we simply regulate to the hypochlorous acid concentration? Because, obviously you don't want to go through running through all those equations every time. So turns out that the ratio of free chlorine and cyanuric acid in the range of interest of typical free chlorine and cyanuric acid that we have in the swimming pools, turns out at a constant ratio you have a near constant hypochlorous acid concentration. So the table that we're showing here is a 20-to-1 ratio of cyanuric acid to free chlorine. You can see that 20-to-1, but you can see that there's also 20-to-1 here, 20-to-1 throughout the table. And you can see that the hypochlorous acid concentration is nearly constant. Because the hypochlorous acid concentration is nearly constant, that means the disinfection rates are going to be nearly constant. Oxidation also of swimsuit skins and hair, corrosion rates, everything fairly consistent. ORP as well, because ORP is a proxy for measuring hypochlorous acid. It's not a direct measure, but it's somewhat proportional. And you can see that throughout this range, it's fairly constant. So that's good news. That says there's a simpler way of making this work. So the recommendation from this is to control a ratio. And whether you do it as a cyanuric acid to free chlorine or whether you flip that around and do a percentage doesn't really matter. The point is that if you regulate to a constant ratio, you'll regulate to a constant disinfection rate. That's the point. Okay. So so now let's look at how do you determine what should the limits be set at, and in order to do that, you have to know, well, what kind of risks are we talking about. So to do that, we looked at or created a steady state pathogen model, and I'm going to go over this briefly, the components of it, as we'll look at the results of it next. So it starts with, in the upper left here, which I'll circle carefully. Apologize for the drawing. I'm using a trackpad, which is not as easy. Okay, so on the left is the introduction of pathogens from an infected bather in the water. So not all bathers are assumed to be infected. There's a certain percentage, which we'll talk about later, but for an infected bather, there's a certain shedding rate that's different for different pathogens. That shedding rate is a function of the concentration of pathogens in their stools or in fecal matter, and then there's an amount of fecal matter that's released over time, and we have a model for all of that. There's a certain percentage of swimmers infected, as I mentioned, and then there's bather load, of course, right? If you don't have many bathers in the water, you don't have a lot of pathogens entering in the water. So all of that results in a pathogen introduction rate. And then if we look at the chemistry side, which we've talked about already, inputs of pH, free chlorine, cyanuric acid, to a lesser effect, the TDS and temperature have a smaller effect. That determines the hypochlorous acid concentration and therefore the disinfection rate. Then, if we feed that into a model that is also looking at diffusion, and which is the transport of the bacteria or protozoa or viruses or what have you from the infected bather to the receiving bather through the typically the fecal to oral route. That's a diffusion model that we used, a turbulent diffusion model. And so all of those other inputs that we mentioned before, plus this new one for diffusion, will determine the concentration of the pathogen at any distance away from the infected bather. And so if you define and say that your receiving bather, ingesting bather is a certain distance away, then you can calculate what the concentration of pathogen in the water is that they're ingesting. And that ingestion is the last part of the model, translating ingestion into risk through a dose-response model, which many of you might be familiar with. And that's going to be a function of the ingestion rate, how long you're in the water, the age of the ingester. Children tend to ingest more, and they also tend to be in the water longer. And then there's a dose-response model that says you ingest a certain amount, CFU or CIS, and then what is the risk of infection. Okay, so you put that all together, and we have a complete model, and we used it. So let's apply it to some specific inputs for some conservative examples and see what happens. Oh, and by the way, as you can see, on this page, the red boxes are the inputs, and the green are the calculated results. All right, so the basic inputs that we used, we wanted it to be very conservative to start with, and then we'd back off to see how things changed or improved as you change parameters. So as you can see here, we used the extreme lowest free chlorine with highest cyanuric acid allowed, which would be the lowest disinfection rate in the current Model Aquatic Health Code. We used a midline pH 7.5, cool water temperature, which has slower disinfection rates. TDS doesn't matter so much. We used children as the ingester, and as well as the infected person, because that gives a larger ingestion rate. Diffusivity we won't talk about too much. We did look at different diffusivities. We used a midline for examples here, but we did look at graphs of seeing how it changed with more diffusion in the water. Diffusion you can think of as turbulence in the water that pushes and disperses the pathogens from the sloughing from the infected bather and getting over to the ingesting bather. Shallow pool depth we used. We used a fairly close distance, 1.5 feet away horizontally and 1.5 feet vertically. Vertically being, your bum is below the water and the mouth is typically near water surface. Ingestion rate and exposure are based on the children assumption, as I had mentioned. Okay. So these are common assumptions in the model, and then let's look at that we use for all the examples. I'm going to let me erase everything, so if we go back to this. Okay. So this is an example to make crystal clear what we're talking about. This is the fecal to oral route, 1.5 feet horizontally, 1.5 feet vertically. Okay. And the bather spacing is not this tight. This is just from the infected bather to the ingester. You'll see that there's a bather spacing as well that we'll talk about in a moment, but that doesn't apply to E. coli as much because you don't need a multi-bather model for E. coli because the kill rates are so fast that distant bathers don't matter. Okay, for E. coli, there's a particular shedding rate. There's a CT value, as you saw from our CT tables. There's the percent of bathers infected was not applicable because it turns out if you increase this, unless you go to about 30% infected bathers, the distant bathers don't contribute enough because primarily the shedding rates are not quite nearly as high in terms of for a dose response, but mostly it's that there's chlorine in the water kills bacteria very quickly. So the chlorine kills the E. coli as it's getting shed from the bather, and if you have a distant bather, another bather away, 4 or 5 feet away, it's not going to have any effect. So it's mostly the bather you're next to that is infected that matters, and you have to stay next to them, close to them the whole time, and that's what this assumes, that you're next to them 1.5 feet away the entire time. So we calculate the hypochlorous acid concentration, calculate the E. coli concentration, and the probability of infection, which you can see per event is quite low. And these are pretty aggressive assumptions too. So, all right. So now let's look at a protozoan oocyst that is moderately resistant to chlorine. Oh, by the way, so 0.009% is about a 1 in 100,000, just to give you a rough perspective. All right. So now we're going to look at an infinite sources model, basically multi-bather model. So in this, pretend this goes to, off to infinity, an infinite-sized pool, just so so we're looking at large pools. And the red people identified there are the infected bathers. The green one is the ingesting bather. So we're close physically for the ingesting bather to the infected bather. There's a certain percentage of bathers infected, 4.4% from Giardia. That comes from the CDC stool study of measured 100 and some odd, or whatever it was, 200 some odd stools. 293 stools, actually, the 13 of which had Giardia in them. And we have a reasonably high bather load also. So this concentration of number of bathers per square foot, not the number of infected bathers per square foot, but number of total bathers per square foot, is 1 bather per 15 square feet. And then, as I say, the 4.4%, you can see that's why only some of them are infected. But we assume that you're right next to one of the infected ones. So again, very conservative, worst-case assumptions, and that you're there the entire time, 1.9 hours, while the children are in the pool. So, all right. Clear this. Okay, so let's apply this to Giardia and see what happens. So we have a shedding rate for Giardia. This is the rate over the first 15 minutes. The model actually has the rate decline over time based on actual on some scientific studies that were shown where it's kind of an exponential decline rate. CT value, which is quite higher, much higher than what we saw before with bacteria. These assumptions are the same, and then the dose response model. Okay, now we have a hypochlorous acid concentration, Giardia concentration, and calculated probability. And here, this caught our attention. 0.12% is not a small, trivial amount. Of course, our assumptions are very conservative and so on, but nevertheless, it was something to look at. So now, let's look at a protozoan oocyst that is highly resistant to chlorine, namely Cryptosporidium. And again, to reemphasize, this is not AFRs. These are asymptomatic bathers without diarrhea. But nevertheless, the studies have shown that for Crypto and Giardia that there are people who don't have symptoms and are sloughing off bacteria. Sloughing off cysts and oocysts. And so that's what this model takes into account. So there is a shedding rate associated with the asymptomatic population. There's a smaller percentage of the population with Crypto. We still have a high bather load. There's a dose response associated with Crypto, and the CT value is very high, as you can see, which means that chlorine's really not going to touch this very much at normal chlorine levels. So we have a low hypochlorous acid concentration because of the 2 ppm free chlorine, 90 ppm cyanuric acid assumption, and a certain amount of oocyst concentration and a probability of event that actually is lower than Giardia. But again, the reason that you don't, well, we'll talk about why we don't see it is why outbreaks look different, but that's because of AFRs. Okay, so now Let's look at how these probabilities of infection change as you change that cyanuric acid to free chlorine ratio. So the graph shown here on the left is a regular linear graph. On the right is logarithmic, so you can see what happens to E. coli because it's really hard to see. E. coli, probability of infection is so low that you really can't see what's going on as you're lowering the ratio of cyanuric acid to free chlorine. But here you can see that it's linear for a while, and then it drops off as you go very low towards no cyanuric acid in the pool. But you can see that for Giardia, it's mostly a slow, somewhat linear drop, and then it goes, it drops further as you have no cyanuric acid. Crypto similarly, but not huge drops all the way. On the linear side, you can see it a little better. Not tremendous drop-offs. Mostly linear, just drops off a little bit more that way. All right. So note that there's part of the reason that Giardia is higher than Crypto. There's 900 times more infective units in the water from the sloughing of Giardia. It's a combination of the higher shedding rate plus the number of the higher percentage of bathers infected. But why is it that we see outbreaks with Crypto and not with Giardia? The reason is AFRs. Accidental fecal release is a different kind of an animal. The volume of the fecal matter in AFR is more than 500 times higher than fecal sloughing. The concentration of those of the Crypto in those with diarrhea may be 10 or more times higher than without diarrhea, based on the studies that we've seen. But the main reason is that the disinfection rate from chlorine is over 340 times slower with Crypto than Giardia. So over time, Crypto is going to build up. Now, and our model, by the way, does not account for any removal of Cicerusis from filtration. So instead, it has just killing from dying from chlorine inactivation, and then also the natural die-off. So in the case of Crypto, the reduction in Crypto happens more from the natural die-off of Crypto than it does from the chlorine inactivation, at least at these chlorine levels that we're talking about. And you can see on the right this pie chart that is taken from CDC reports that's showing that Crypto is the one that shows up in terms of outbreaks, and that makes sense. But again, it's really based due to the AFRs and not due to fecal sloughing, at least based on what we've seen in terms of calculations to date. All right, so what can we conclude here? So there's the probability of infection is affected by many different factors. It increases as the cyanuric acid-free chlorine level increases. In other words, as you increase the cyanuric acid level or decrease the free chlorine level, basically reducing this ratio, or if you like to think of it the other way around, is the free chlorine cyanuric acid percentage. As you increase that percentage or decrease that percentage, the probability of infection increases. And as we saw from the charts, until you get to really no cyanuric acid, it's somewhat linear for Giardia and a little bit stronger for E. coli. The risk from E. coli is inconsequential in public health as long as chlorine residual is present. I didn't show you here in the presentation, but I did run the model with no chlorine, for example. And E. coli with moderate levels of turbulence in the water are still pretty low risk. But if you have still water, if there's not a lot of turbulence, if you're in an area without a lot of good circulation and you have no chlorine, then the risks really start to shoot up because basically you build up higher concentrations of chlorine around the infected bather, and then that can become more of an issue. When you have chlorine added, though, it just poof goes away. I mean, drops significantly. So that's why we concluded this. The increase in risk to Giardia is greater than E. coli and Crypto, and the 0.12% is something that gained our attention. So what happens to the infection risk if we lower the CYAFC limit, the ratio? Here's an example where we start with the ratio of 45, which is the limit that is currently in the MAC. By the way, I should comment that the MAC range today in terms of the 2 ppm 90 ppm, 2 ppm free chlorine, 90 ppm cyanuric acid compared to 10 ppm free chlorine to no cyanuric acid, that's a range of over a factor of 500 in disinfection oxidation rates, swimsuit skins and hair, potentially corrosion rates, outgassing rates, and so on. So it's really huge. So if instead the ratio is managed, then we can have a much narrower range of disinfection rates on the one side and the negatives of potentially disinfection byproducts, corrosion rates, and so on the other side. So, okay, so back to this chart. So 45 is the one extreme, as I said, that's the lowest hypochlorous acid concentration. It's the highest cyanuric acid with lowest free chlorine, 2 and 90, free chlorine to cyanuric acid. And 20 is what we compared it to. You can see that the relative risk is roughly a factor of 2 cut down for Giardia and over a factor of 5 for E. coli, but of course E. coli was already low to begin with, so it's really Giardia that we're interested in. Okay, so hear this. All right, so let's wrap up so we can get to the Q&A, because I know and I apologize for rushing through this, but I wanted to be able to leave plenty of time for the Q&A. The results are providing general trends only. Take it with a grain of salt because it's better than nothing because it is scientifically sound and based. But the inputs to the model are quite varying. The difference between the concentrations of pathogens in fecal matter, for example, depends on the pathogen, but they can vary by a factor of 100 from the low to the high. We took middle-of-the-road median levels for all of these, the median in, or average in log space, and which is what the studies typically did, but the ranges are huge. And then the range in terms of the amount of fecal sloughing, in terms of how much fecal material is released, is also broad. So the combination is quite large, up to a factor of 1,000 difference. So, you know, if you're unlucky near a bather near an infected bather who happens to be sloughing on the high side, you know, you're going to be at much significantly higher risk. On the other hand, you know, we were being extremely conservative, saying you're next to that bather for nearly 2 hours, you know, so only 1.5 feet away. But nevertheless, the point is that you can have a wide range. And if you're lucky and you're near someone that's not infected or has infected with a very low sloughing rate, your risk is going to be considerably lower. Now, we did compare this to existing studies of actual concentrations measured in pools, as well as reports for you know, people getting infected and such, but it's mostly for the concentrations in pools. And the model actually does translate pretty well to that, which was in some ways a little bit surprising because even the wide range, but it did work out. So the other point is hypochlorous acid is the active sanitizer, not hypochlorite ion, not the chlorine bound to cyanuric acid. Hypochlorous acid is approximately constant when the ratio is constant, so you can regulate the ratio. The current MAC limit gives a ratio of 45. Should we reduce it to 20 or lower? If we do 20, the thinking is that there's not going to be too much operational impact in most cases. And yet it gives some benefit, so it might be a good starting point. And then as further research is done, we can see if it does need to be, if it makes sense to go lower, but that would be a possible starting point. So what is acceptable? Oh, excuse me, let me erase this. Let me go back to, too late. Okay. So what is an acceptable risk, and are there any unintended consequences? So the unintended consequences would be our study here only looked at half of the issue, which was the disinfection rate when for chlorine, for the hypochlorous acid concentration. So that's why you would set a minimum level of chlorine. But what we did not look at is the other side of the equation, which is the issue, which is that how much is too much chlorine? Because, you know, if you don't look at that, if you don't look at how much is too much chlorine, then, you know, the answer is obvious from a health perspective. Well, just put more chlorine in the water, right? You know, have no cyanuric acid or have very minimal with very high free chlorine levels. Why even have a free chlorine limit at all other than the EPA? Okay, well, why does the EPA have a limit? Why are there limits on the high end? Well, the reason is that there's no free lunch here. Chlorine has side effects. And the main side effects are disinfection byproducts. And when you have higher chlorine levels, you tend to produce disinfection byproducts faster because of the way chemistry works with higher concentrations, having reaction rates go faster. So that's one downside. The other downside is chlorine is also an oxidizer, and it oxidizes anything that, all nitrogenous components, many nitrogenous compounds, and others. And that includes swimsuit skin and hair, for example. So there's potential, bather comfort or long-term degradation issues there. It also can affect corrosion rates, including metal corrosion. There's outgassing, although outgassing is usually more associated with chloramines than with chlorine, but chlorine also outgasses. And if you don't have cyanuric acid in the water at all, it outgasses much faster. That's, in fact, I remember in high school I dechlorinated water for fish tanks by just leaving them open to the air, and that's because they didn't have any cyanuric acid, and if they did, they would have taken 20 times longer or 30 times longer to outgas. So, so we're thinking that just changing the recommendation to a ratio of about 20 is possibly prudent at this point, but again, we want to open it up for discussion. So this is the summary table of what we're potentially proposing, although it's still in discussion in committee. But this is what it would look like. Because people, operators are not going to calculate ratios in their head necessarily and so on. You'd publish a table like this. I did get feedback from another talk that I gave on this presentation in California that even a table would be too complicated for some operators. So what the thought was that while this would be for the, advanced or operators who were able to deal with a table like this, that perhaps some specific minimum was set saying if you can't deal with the table, don't exceed, say, 40 ppm cyanuric acid, and then at that point you need at least 2 ppm free chlorine or something like that. There are other reasons, by the way, why you'd want to limit the amount of cyanuric acid that are not related to what we just talked about in terms of disinfection. Because for disinfection, you can just increase the free chlorine level, and as the cyanuric acid increases, and you get exactly the same disinfection. But other reasons why you might limit cyanuric acid is mainly the risk side of if you were to have an AFR, particularly diarrhea, and you were to need to do superchlorination, that's just not practical when cyanuric acid gets high. You'd have to have the free chlorine level about 10 ppm higher than the cyanuric acid level in order to get equivalent to 10 ppm without cyanuric acid, roughly speaking. So, when you got 60 ppm cyanuric acid in the water, you're not going to raise the chlorine level to 70 ppm. It's just not practical. So if you have a smaller pool, maybe that's okay, because then you would change the water. If you had secondary disinfection, maybe that's okay, because you just run your ozone UV system, all day and night. But in other situations, it might not be practical. So, okay. So at this point, I'd like to open it up for, I think there's just references. Thank you. I do have some additional bonus material, but we'll talk about that based on the Q&A. So I'd like to open it up for Q&A at this point. I don't hear anything. I can see the chat, though.
Hi, Richard. Yeah, we haven't actually received any questions through the chat yet. Everyone, please feel free to enter your questions in the chat box. So we did just get one question here. What about the 7.5% cyanuric acid reduction factor?
Right. So a 7.5% free chlorine to cyanuric acid ratio is equivalent to the CYA over FC of 13, just to give you comparable to what we were talking about in terms of 45 and 20 and so on. So where that came from, that came from a totally different perspective. So that came from the residential, largely from the residential pool market, and was the amount of chlorine needed in order to prevent algae growth independent of algae nutrient level, independent of phosphate and nitrate level. For green and black algae, yellow mustard algae needs more and more, like 15% ratio. So that's where that came from. That did not come from any kind of a disinfection analysis. And what we're talking about here is more disinfection analysis. So what that means is if you were to have the 20 to 1 is equivalent to a 5% ratio. If you were to have that then you would be on the edge of potentially having some green algae growth if you had high phosphate levels and you didn't have anything else to supplement. That's what that means. But it really has, it's not in terms of the disinfection rates, it's a little bit higher. But that 7.5% really came from as an algae inhibition limit. Okay. Someone developed.
Awesome. Thank you, Richard. So let's see.
Oh, hypochlorous loss model. So yeah, there are so hypochlorous acid is does get lost at a slower rate. In fact, I did do for Doug. I haven't turned it over yet, but I've been working on a chlorine usage model, and as part of that, there's both breakdown from sunlight as well as outgassing. But the sunlight loss is the main loss that you get. That's, of course, one of the reasons cyanuric acid is used in pools. It moderates chlorine strength, but it also helps reduce the loss from breakdown from sunlight. And yes, there's significantly lower losses. At 20 versus 45, there's a little more loss, but it's not, not hugely significant. It turns out, let me go back on the slide here. It turns out if you go to higher cyanuric acid levels in the pool, even if you raise the free chlorine so that the hypochlorous acid concentration is constant, it turns out that there's seems to be lower loss from sunlight, possibly due to some CYA shielding effect. But there's not specific technical detail on that yet. I'd love to have somebody do a spectrum of this and we get some actual numbers. But yeah, there are some rough models that I've got for that. Okay. Chlorine has adverse effects on humans in high quantities or the side effects of cyanuric acid. So the EPA has documents submitted from the numerous tests that were done on cyanuric acid. Cyanuric acid itself is, relatively speaking, pretty innocuous in the sense that it is, I'm not talking about from massive ingestion and so on, but talking about from there's virtually no skin absorption. They've done skin studies on it and so on, and you do have to ingest quite a bit before it's an issue. You might remember the melamine issue with melamine cyanurate in the liver and so on, and infant formulas and all that. So cyanuric acid would come into play more from that, but no, it's really one of the lower health risk items in the pool, especially compared to disinfection byproducts. Someone needs to turn off there. Okay, does it make sense to not recommend cyanuric acid in pools since you need to dump water to reduce? That's going to be an operational decision. If you don't use cyanuric acid in pools at all, then you really have a pretty high hypochlorous acid concentration, which means you'd really want to keep the free chlorine level low, and that can be difficult to do. There's a 1 ppm minimum in the U.S. In Europe, they go the other approach of they don't use cyanuric acid, but they go down to 0.3 to 0.6 without ozone and 0.2 to 0.5 with ozone of free chlorine levels. And they're able to do that primarily because they have design pools with excellent circulation, so they can not run out of chlorine in the pool. But that's not the case in most of our pools here in the U.S., so it's a challenge. And then in the U.S. also, we don't allow below 1 ppm currently. So it's a tough call. Probably I'd say a compromise would be, as is for Scott's question, a compromise would be if you have a low cyanuric acid level, 20 or 30, then you can, if you had 20, something like that, you could superchlorinate to 30 ppm free chlorine. I mean, it's not out of this world. And then also that's why the CDC right now is looking at alternatives such as adding sodium chloride to produce chlorine dioxide in overnight situations to do remediation. Okay. Does anyone know at what temperature chlorine starts gasifying? Yeah, there are rates. I have some of that in terms of the potential outgassing rates, the Henry's law constants for chlorine. The bottom line is when you got cyanuric acid in the water and you're talking about the low hypochlorous acid concentrations that we're talking about here, you can almost pretty much ignore the outgassing of chlorine. Chlorine's going to get used up through other mechanisms, not so much outgassing. But if you don't have any cyanuric acid in the water and you've got, it's significantly higher in terms of hypochlorous acid concentration and the outgassing. But of course, the chlorine's going to be reacting with anything in the waters. It's the bather load, the swimsuit skin and hair and so on that's in the water, so it's going to do that as well. And as far as temperature, yeah, hot tubs outgas faster. I mean, I think that's probably where that's coming from. It does increase significantly. But again, when there's cyanuric acid in the water, it's not as much. So in residential hot tubs, they're using dichlor. They tend not to lose the chlorine as much. But if you're in a commercial pool or commercial spa that doesn't have cyanuric acid in it, yeah, you're going to lose chlorine a lot faster, especially from the aeration. And then there's UV effects as well. But in terms of something like a spa, it's mostly the aeration. Outbreaks, Dwayne's question, many of our outbreaks are occurring at water parks where there is more turbulence in the pool. Do you look at how this could affect transmission exposure? Yes, our model has turbulence, a turbulent diffusion model, so we can increase that and see what happens. However, our model was a steady state model. In other words, what we looked at first was what happens over time, because this was numerous bathers in the pool with slow fecal sloughing, and over some period of minutes to hours, depending on the pathogen, you get to somewhat of a state of equilibrium in terms of the concentration in the water, and that's primarily what we looked at. What you're describing would be more for outbreaks would be an AFR, and that would be a dynamic model, which would be a real-time model. That's much more complicated to do. That is something that we're looking at doing in the future. What I do have, and I can share with you, is not the dynamic model part of it for the turbulence, but I can show you what happens with AFRs, and let me show you that, in the steady state. So this chart that I'm showing now, I'm assuming I'm still sharing, so this chart shows the AFR risk with that 45 ratio, which is the limit, 2 ppm free chlorine, 90 ppm cyanuric acid, or in the Model Aquatic Health Code. And what you can see, I assumed a 100,000 gallon pool with a typical AFR release amount in the mid-range amount, and I have a high amount too. Remember I said that there's a lot of variation in the concentration in fecal matter, so I show both here. I'm assuming instant mixing in this case. So this is not answering your question, but it's true. If once we do our model, more sophisticated model of a dynamic model, it will show that when you have a lot of turbulence in the pool, you're going to spread more cysts, which is a good and bad news. That means the people near the infected bather are going to get a lower concentration because it's diluting faster, but the people further away are going to get a higher concentration. And depending on where the threshold is, you're probably going to have more bathers infected if you had less time for the disinfection to cut it down. But in the case of crypto, the disinfection rate is so slow, it's almost not relevant. It's really Giardia where that effect would show up more. Okay, so now let's compare this. Let's continue with this and compare this 45 ratio again. Well, okay, so see the crypto is really not touched by the chlorine, over a day, right? But Giardia is, right? So let me get rid of these lines. All right, now compare to 20, right? So what we're proposing is going down to this, so from 45 to 20. So even in the case of AFRs, assuming an instant mixing, okay, model again. So you can see Giardia is cut down, right? And crypto's not really touched because crypto's not touched with chlorine. Now, if you didn't have any cyanuric acid in the water at all, you've got Giardia having very minimal, short-term effect, and you have crypto starting to come down. But you can accomplish something very similar with secondary disinfection as well, that not only it doesn't so much affect Giardia, but that helps with crypto. And this is why secondary disinfection, meaning UV or ozone or something that removes crypto on each pass, this is why you would have that in the water. And this is a conservative one of 6-hour turnover. You could have faster turnovers to be better. So if you compare this secondary disinfection versus no secondary disinfection, you can see Giardia is affected a little, but crypto is affected a lot. And what it does is it cuts it down to, this is going to be a one-day event, no more than a one-day event, probably a half-day event. If you have secondary disinfection. If you don't have secondary disinfection, even with no cyanuric acid in the water, you're still talking about a multi-day event, week-long event. Can ORP be used in some way with hypochlorous acid? Yeah, the problem is that the relationship of ORP is affected by so many other things in terms of hydrogen gas levels from saltwater chlorine generators, the presence of other organics in the water that reduce it, that act as reducing agents. The different manufacturers' probes measure differently. The probes foul over time. So the ORP really is best used as a, what would you call it, a process control. You measure your actual free chlorine and cyanuric acid to get an idea of what the ratio should be, what the hypochlorous acid concentration should be, and then you set your set point for your ORP. And then it'll work for a few hours or whatever, or maybe a day or so. And then you have to reset your set point, and you should be testing every day. Anyway, that's how ORP really should be used. I have tables to kind of roughly correlate ORP, hypochlorous acid, but again, there's so many other factors that you just can't use a table. You have to really do the measurements with field test kits, like a FAS-DPD accurate test kit or a DPD test kit, and then knowing the free chlorine cyanuric acid ratio, then you have it set where you want, then see what the ORP is and set the set point that way. Is there any benefit to using carbon dioxide? Not with anything that we talked about. Carbon dioxide, there's tremendous benefits for pH control at lower cost, but it's not going to have anything to do with the disinfection, or very little to do with this disinfection. There's plenty of carbonates in the water without using CO2. So there's CO2 in the water already. Let's see, if 7.5 is required to prevent algae growth, if we are guiding the pool industry, why would we not use this number and know it also takes care of disinfection? This is Kevin's question. So the reason you could use a 7.5 ratio if you want. It's free chlorine to cyanuric acid, 7.5%. So if you want the cyanuric acid over free chlorine, as I said, that's 0.075 over 1 inverse. It's about a factor of 13, so closer to a 10 ratio of cyanuric acid to free chlorine. So you could do that, but again, it's not necessary because you can, if you have, say, if you have phosphate control or algicides or other methods of controlling algae, then you can have a lower free chlorine level if you want. But again, this is all up to you guys. What we were focused on is what's the minimum really do we want to have for a minimum amount of disinfection. We weren't looking at other operational issues. That makes it a little more complicated as far as the choices that you have. Okay, Lucy asks, need a practical remedy for the treatment of AFRs, have some larger pools on their wells, water supply draining and refilling, busy community pools. Any suggestions? Yeah, it's tough. So, Lucy, so basically you can, if you avoid increasing the CYA too much, and I know that may be tough because if you're using trichlor tabs, it's going to go every 10 ppm of free chlorine added by trichlor adds 6 ppm of cyanuric acid. Every 10 of free chlorine added by dichlor adds 9 ppm of cyanuric acid. Every 10 of cal-hypo adds almost 8 calcium hardness. So, the chemicals other than hypochlorite, which is just adding salt, 10 ppm adds about 17 ppm salt. Chemicals added to the pool have side effects, and cyanuric acid buildup is an issue. About all you could do is try to keep it lower, use other forms of chlorine or complement with mixtures of different types of chlorine. Not at the same time, not together, obviously, physically, but, over time. And that's about all you could do. And you could keep the cyanuric acid level down to 20-30 range, and you have a hope of superchlorinating. But the other is secondary disinfection. If you put in UV ozone, then you could run that with circulation to clear the pool. And then down the road, we'll have the chlorine dioxide option, hopefully, but that's not available yet. Yeah, Doug responded. Install secondary disinfection. That was one of my, okay. Secondary disinfection for the model, it didn't really matter. The secondary disinfection assumed a 99.9% disinfection, but it doesn't really matter. You get almost the same results here. I'm showing it now. The secondary disinfection, it doesn't really matter. If you did even 99% or even 90%, you'd have almost exactly the same effect. So if you used coagulation flocculation with removal of cysts through filtration, and you figured out a way to not have the revert, after backwashing, that it wouldn't go back into the system, which is an issue, which is why it wasn't approved as necessarily an alternative. But if you could figure that out, that would even work as a method. But for sure, any of the UV or ozone systems doesn't matter which you'd use. Yeah, secondary disinfection is rarely used, so that's why you have to look at keeping CYA down, at least in the larger pools and such. 1 to 10 ppm. Not sure what the question was. Has the MAC committee proposed recommending that stabilized chlorine not be used in commercial applications to avoid? No, that hasn't. That's not what's being asked. Free chlorine. Let's see. Many bacterial, known as chlorine resistant. Pharma-resistant E. coli. We can look at some of the bacteria that are more resistant, but what we were looking at is what comes from typical fecal bacteria. So if you have, Harvey, if you have something, send it to us if you have something of concern, and we'll look up and make sure we take a look at it. Hard to sell. Does sunlight work as a secondary disinfectant? No, sunlight is not nearly fast enough. UV and sunlight is a mild disinfectant, so it's something over a longer period of time for some certain kinds of water, but it's not going to do anything to the cysts anyway. It's mostly for bacteria, or not do very much for the cysts. CYA limit of 50 in Kentucky in the outdoor pools, not allowed in indoor, right? Okay. Similar chart idea, looking at Adam's question for some time, but have not seen any strong backing research into the appropriate numbers. No hang up on the ratio. Is there a thought to expand the chart for pH influence and outer range? Yes, except that when cyanuric acid is present, remember that pH has a relatively small effect on the hypochlorous acid concentration, so that's why we didn't look at that effect. Basically, going from a pH of 7.5 to 8, when cyanuric acid is present, it only drops the hypochlorous acid level by 15%, which is not that much, so that's why we didn't look at that. Pseudomonas is an issue. Yeah, we did look. There wasn't a lot of literature on the Pseudomonas kill times. There was some, but we didn't chart that. Biofilm, one of the main ways of preventing the biofilm is to maintain a chlorine level in the pool at all times. If you kill the bacteria before they can significantly form biofilms, that's one of the best ways. And of course, brushing the pool, especially for plaster pools, just like brushing your teeth, helps prevent biofilms from sticking too much, growing to too much of an extent. Okay, send further questions. Good questions. I don't know. You can give my email address out.
Okay. There's also the option to sign up for the MAC network if you'd like to send any questions that direction. That email address is macnet@nacho.org. That's MAHCNET@nacho.org. You can also sign up for the MAC network there and receive other updates. And we are almost at time, so thank you, Richard, so much for your presentation, for imparting your knowledge on the audience. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. The webinar will be recorded and it will be sent to you if you registered for the event. It will also be available on our website. And with that, we're concluding our January MAC webinar. So thank you all for your participation. Have a great afternoon. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
The chairperson has disconnected. The conference will now end.